I'm convinced there's a link between hatred of people and terrorism. Okay, I don't need persuasion of that. I don't think a definition of any sort of hatred is going to help. My worry actually is about what happens with this definition when it escapes into the real world and how it's used by real people. Is with a loose definition, we are going to tend towards more censorship. I'm not worried about me, I'm not worried about central government. I am worried though about all the tiers of organisations, private, public bodies that make up real life. I just don't think that the anti-Muslim hatred definition is going to help, and I think it will do more harm than good.
Hello, I'm Georgina Mumford, and I'm delighted to be joined today by independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Jonathan Hall. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hi.
Jonathan, I wanted to talk to you today about the government's new introduction of an anti-Muslim bigotry definition. Now, this definition in theory has been put forward to protect British Muslims from discrimination, violence, all manner of harms. As the government has said, we can't tackle a problem if we can't define it. However, a few people have now come forward, yourself included, and said that maybe this isn't going to look exactly how we hope it will in practice. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, can you outline where you stand on the definition at the moment, and what are the key areas that we should be looking at and maybe concerned about?
I'm convinced there's a link between hatred of people and terrorism. Okay, I don't need persuasion of that. I don't think a definition of any sort of hatred is going to help. And what's my evidence for that? My evidence is actually that there's been a definition of anti-Semitism since 2016, and it hasn't, I'm afraid, reduced attacks on Jews. I don't think this is going to reduce attacks on Muslims. So it's not, I don't think, going to achieve anything, and it has some real drawbacks in my view. The first thing is, and I'm not going to please everyone by saying this, my concern is not about central government. If you look at the government's overall strategy, which is about cohesion, I think there's a lot of strength in that. And they've made the right noises. My worry actually is about what happens with this definition when it escapes into the real world and how it's used by real people. Because the government has said it's not just for central government, it's for everyone. And they have positively encouraged public bodies, so like local authorities, libraries, museums, charities, private sector, all of these different organizations and people to adopt it. And I think my worry is with a loose definition, we are going to tend towards more censorship, because that has been the experience, hasn't it? With the Islamophobia definition, it never became a formal definition, but it was used, as we know, from the grooming gangs incident. We know from the resistance to investigating what was happening with the Trojan horse scandal, which some of your viewers may not remember, but it was something that happened in Birmingham, where it was established that some schools were under pressure by Islamists to change their behavior in line with Islamist values. Now, we already know, don't we, that Islamophobia is used to shut down investigating and talking about things that really, really matter and are valuable to talk about. And my fear is the same will happen with this definition, because there are, and I think the government recognises this in their wider strategy document, some quite deliberate people, activists, entryists, who will seek to exploit this.
And you mentioned there this could shut down quite important national conversations. Are there any topics in particular that you're worried we won't be able to talk about, or that people will be more hesitant to talk about as a result of this definition?
Yeah, many. Migration is the first one, isn't it? I've been around long enough to remember when it was seen as completely wrong even to talk about the impact of migration. It is now finally something that people are able to talk about, and they have to be able to talk about it because so many people around the world are on the move. They're coming from different countries. We need to be able to debate who should get visas, who should not get visas, what's the effect of migration, how do you deal with integration, what are the drawbacks, what are the costs. All of these things are really important. A lot of people are on the move from Muslim countries. A lot of the hotspots which have conflict are Muslim majority countries, and we've got to be able to talk about it. The example that I gave in a speech in January was about Abd al-Fattah, who, if you remember, he was an Egyptian activist, and it later turned out from his social media posts that he was also profoundly anti-Semitic, quite vicious actually in what he had been saying. And in the speech I gave in January, I said, well, why is it? How is it that someone who was a brave activist, a human rights activist, could also be so anti-Semitic? And does that reflect something more widely in Middle East society? And I don't know the answer to that. I would like to have the answer to that. And I would be worried that this anti-Muslim hatred definition will be used to shut down questions like that, because someone will say, well, look, the effect of what you're saying is effectively to slur an entire group of Muslims, and therefore it's an example of hatred. So that's my sort of worry.
And if you read the definition, actually the language in there seems to conflate Islam, which is a faith, with race and with ethnicity. Is that something that concerns you as well?
I mean, this is something that has bothered me a bit less. And I mean, the truth is that they did make some changes. I saw the first version of it, which was different, and they have put in, and I think this is important, that it only counts as anti-Muslim hatred if it is intentionally causing hatred to Muslims. That seems to be very important. The problem is, I just don't think these subtleties are going to be noticed when it gets down to local libraries, who will suddenly be told, that book on your shelves, that's an example of anti-Muslim hatred. When local authorities start having programs about anti-Muslim hatred and what can we do to decrease it, I think they will lose sight of what this strategy is really about. So, it's like releasing something into the wild. I think it's going to be dangerous when it has contact at a local level. And I mean, the other thing that I still have objections about, is that when it gave examples about things that could be talked about, the example that it's given is very vague. It's in the public interest. So the government has said, and of course the government shouldn't be telling us what we can and cannot say, but the government has said it is not anti-Muslim hatred to raise concerns in the public interest. Again, frankly, if you're someone hard-pressed member of a local library, say, you're not going to have time to go through all the policy documents and read them as a whole, and you will come under pressure. And I don't at the moment have a huge amount of confidence that local organisations, charities, private sector are necessarily going to be able to resist the pressure to self-censor about things that are really, really important.
And I guess another question that people are keen to know is why Islam and why in this moment? Because you mentioned that we've had this working definition of anti-Semitism since 2016 that hasn't really done much. As I understand it, there are already protections in law for faith groups. So why at this point in time does it seem that this particular faith group needs extra protections, as it were?
Well, I think it's because it was a Labour Party government manifesto. Manifesto commitments. So I think that's why. I mean, the timing, who knows why it came in at this particular time. I mean, the definition has been worked on for a long time. And I guess if there hadn't been such sort of strength of feeling about the nature of the definition, which I should say was even wider, the draft that I saw, if that could have come out last year, and that would have been even worse. I mean, look, I think it's worth saying that from a national security perspective, this is what I'm concerned about. The terrorism, the ability of states to exploit social division, to stir up hatred, create disorder on the streets, real things. Remember, there are Russian bot farms, there are Chinese operations of influence, there are Iranian agents of influence trying to interfere in our democracy, and they will use hostility and hatred between ethnic groups, between religions. It is important, and the government is right to have a strategy about that. I just don't think that the anti-Muslim hatred definition is going to help, and I think it will do more harm than good.
And do you get the sense, if we zoom out and look at UK culturally as a whole, that maybe we're becoming less tolerant to having conversations about religion?
Completely. I mean, and I think the thing that sort of bothers me is that I'm a lawyer. I've got this statutory position. It's fine for someone like me. I can talk about difficult things. I've been into prisons and written a couple of reports, and I've said that Islamism is a real problem. But I can tell you, I was also getting from prison officers when I would speak to them that they found it hard because people were accusing them of being Islamophobic then, and no doubt they'll be using the anti-Muslim hatred definition against them. It's hard just for normal members of the public to deal with this sort of stuff. So I'm not worried about me. I'm not worried about central government. I am worried, though, about all the tiers of organizations, private, public bodies that make up real life.
As you just mentioned there, this is a non-statutory definition. It's not going to be pushed through in law in any way. This will all to do with institutions. So what does that actually look like in practice then when it comes to limiting people's free speech? Is it just sort of a psychological pressure?
Well, you've got to remember that free speech operates in two ways. You've got the sort of formal legal framework that if I was to say I support Al-Qaeda, would come down, if I meant it, would come down under the Terrorism Act, which limits my speech in law. But then you've also got all of the real stuff in the real world, like, can I book that venue to have a meeting? If I do have a venue, is there going to be a huge amount of disruption? Can I study something, or will the course or the topic that I want to study for my master's dissertation be deemed to be incorrect? All of these things have an impact on free speech in the real world, and lawyers talk about something called the chilling effect, and I think that's right. If you're trying to become, get into a position of power and you feel that you will cross the line because there is a general feeling that what you're saying is unacceptable, then everyone will end up thinking in the same way. And I think that, thinking again from a national security perspective, let's say that we came to a sort of wartime situation. The win for a hostile state would be to persuade people that they shouldn't fight. And one of the ways of doing that is to set us against one another, and to some extent to say that, Britain, its history, its culture is illegitimate, and therefore nothing worth defending. If you think about the cultural organizations, I don't think they've been particularly open, you talked about earlier, to conversations, to challenging topics. We all know the sorts of things that museums tend to put on. I don't necessarily trust that those people, who after all have also got to do lots of other things as well, but maybe have a certain sort of political leaning, are going to be able to see the anti-Muslim hatred definition in the way that perhaps the government does. And the government has, I think, rightly recognized that things like cultural institutions and culture is an important aspect of social coherence. And so what we don't want to have, I would have thought, if you were the government, or indeed me as an independent reviewer, I don't think you want to have every museum saying that Britain is illegitimate and its history is illegitimate and that it's an example of Muslim hatred, etc., etc., etc. And at the moment, I fear that the cultural organizations as well as the local authorities won't have that ability to say, actually, no, we're not going to go down that line. And even if they manage to resist it themselves of their own accord, there are going to be pressure groups, entryists and activists. Again, the government recognizes this in their strategy. So their overall strategy has got a lot of good parts to it. They'll be putting pressure on and saying, that's an example of anti-Muslim hatred. You need to have a program on this. You need to change that. Now, I don't know. Of course, I can't predict the future. But I think my overall point is hatred is bad, undoubtedly. Definitions of hatred don't help. That's the evidence about anti-Semitism. And I think there are real risks. And I just hope that not just at the high level of central government, but also looking all the way through society, are we going to monitor the effect of this definition? And if it turns out that this is leading to self-censorship and a lack of free speech, is the government going to be prepared to change course and say, actually, we've tried it and it doesn't work?
And I suppose we are so sensitive to issues of censorship in the UK at the moment because we've been having so many issues with it lately. We've got 30 people a day being arrested for things that they've said online. We had a very high-profile incident when comedy writer Graham Linehan was arrested by armed police at an airport for something that he tweeted. Why do you think that law enforcement have become so zealous with prosecuting people for things that they've said online?
Well, I think that the non-hate crime incidents, which is what you're talking about with Graham Linehan, which was completely idiotic, I think it's because the Home Office had a way of measuring the effectiveness of forces. And one way of proving that you have found offences and solving them is to look at tweets. And you can do that from the comfort of your own office. And I think that, to be blunt, the police took their eye off the ball and they prioritised something which they should not have been doing. And they should have been out on the beat, solving burglaries and car theft and rape and things like that. So I think it was partly there were some perverse incentives at work. I think I should be clear that those who say that everything is about censorship, I think I would sort of depart from them. There are some people who say that even the Online Safety Act and the idea of looking at and removing content online is itself a terrible act. And there are voices from America who take this very sort of stringent First Amendment approach that you shouldn't take anything down. I have to say, I disagree with them. And that's just from bitter experience. I've spoken to young terrorists now serving very long periods of time who were radicalized on Instagram. And it was only because of what they saw, the accounts that they followed, the messages, and the websites that they went to. They are now serving very long periods of time in prison. And on the way, I should say, contemplated carrying out horrific acts. So I think to anyone who says that everything is censorship and therefore bad, I would disagree. But we are undoubtedly in a world where there's a geopolitical question about regulation of the internet, and there has been massive overreach, as you rightly say, about the Graham Linehan example, where the police prioritise speech offences over other things.
And finally, Jonathan, I wanted to ask you, is there any way that we could maybe adapt this definition in such that it could be useful potentially, or is it just something that's going to have to be scrapped and a government are going to have to look for other solutions to the problems they're seeking to solve?
I don't know, but I suppose the thing that I've never really been able to work out is what the purpose of it is. And I think I would find it much easier. I mean, I'm a lawyer, I'm used to drafting documents and drafting provisions, etc. I find it much easier if I knew what the purpose of it actually was intended to be. Not having a purpose, it's quite hard at the moment to work out how there could be any successful definition. And the risk is always going to be that busy officials, people working in business, etc., will just not look at the wider picture. And the government has got a lot of good stuff in its wider picture, and they will be pushed into self-censorship.
Jonathan Hall, thank you very much.